Dear watchers, hello and welcome to another video from us, the Beatdown Masters. We love Magic and especially Commander. Today we have a recording of a EDH game for you, so let's get to the introduction of our Spellslingers. First, we have Knots, who plays with Alela, Artful Provocateur. This flyer token deck has a lot of artifacts and enchantments in it to maximize the value from Alela's abilities. Knots had to mulligan down to 5, and his opening hand contains an island, an exotic orchard, a command tower, a soul ring, and a grand architect. Second, we have Kai, who is piloting Obosh the Prey Piercer. This Rakdos build utilizes odd CMC spells to double as much damage as possible and killing its opponents out of nowhere. Kai's opening hand contains a Browbeat, a Mountain, a Viashino Heretic, an Ancient Tomb, a Stormbreath Dragon, a Commander Sphere, and a Sin Brother. Third, we have Dario, who plays with Hogaak Arisen Necropolis. This deck is all about graveyard synergies and uses Hogaak to generate as much value as possible. Dario's starting hand consists of a Swamp, a Command Tower, a Ramanap Excavator, a Skull Prophet, a Mulk, a Greater Good, and an Opposition Agent. Finally, we have Luke, who plays with Kalamax the Stormsire. This Spellslinger deck is utilizing Kalamax's ability to gain huge value of costly spells. After dominating the board, this deck wins with commanded damage or a huge spell. Luke's opening hand contains a Back to Basics, an island, a snow-covered island, an Evolving Wilds, a mountain, a Blind Blast, and a Channeled Force. With no further ado, let's get the game started. Knot starts the game and plays a command tower, and then brings the turn 1 Soul Ring on the table. He then passes to Kai. Kai draws, plays a mountain, and then gives the turn to Dario. After he draws his card, Dario also brings a command tower into play. The turn shifts to Luke, which plays an Evolving Wilds and sacks it immediately to search for a snow-covered forest. Knot starts his second turn by playing an island, and then pays 4 mana to play a Grand Architect. With nothing else, he gives the turn to Kai. Kai draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He then pays 3 mana and loses 2 lives from the Ancient Tomb to cast a Sin Brother. The turn shifts to Dario. He draws and plays a Swamp. He pays 2 mana to play a Skull Prophet. After that, he passes to Luke. Luke draws, plays an island, and then casts Lightning Greaves, and gives the turn to Knots. Knots untaps, draws, and plays a Plains. He then brings his commander, Alela, Artful Provocateur, into play by paying 5 mana. Set up for his future turns, he gives the turn to Kai. In Kai's upkeep, the Sin Brother triggers, and he reveals the top card of his library, which is a mountain. Dario decides to pay 0 lives in order to shift the mountain to the graveyard. After that, Kai draws his card for the turn. He then plays a Swamp, and follows up by playing a Cultivator's Caravan. Kai then moves to his attack phase and declares the Sin Brother as an attacker for Dario. Dario is unable to block because of the Sin Brother's menace and takes 3 damage. After combat, with nothing else to do, Kai gives the turn to Dario. Dario begins his third turn by playing an Ancient Tomb. He then casts a Mulk, revealing the top 4 cards of his library. He is able to put 3 forests into his hand, and the Doom Whisperer goes into his graveyard. After that, he discards to hand size and gives the turn to Luke. Luke first plays a mountain, and follows up by playing a Back to Basics, which enters the battlefield under loud company of the rest of the table. He then passes to Knots. Knots untaps, draws, and then plays a Swamp. He immediately moves to his combat phase and declares Alela as an attacker for Luke in order to say thank you for the Back to Basics. Luke obviously declares no blockers and takes 3 damage. Due to the lifelink, Knots gains 3 lives. Deciding to do nothing else in his turn, he shifts the turn to Kai. Kai untaps, and in his upkeep the Sin Brother triggers again. Kai reveals a Wayfarer's Bauble. Dario again decides to take the 1 damage so Kai don't get it to put it into his hand. He then draws for the turn. He plays a mountain and casts a Commander Sphere. Kai then moves to his combat phase and attacks Knots with the Sim Brother. Knots takes the 3 damage and then the turn shifts to Dario. At the end of Kai's turn, Dario activates the Skull Prophet and mills top 2 cards of his library, which are 2 lands. He then begins his own turn. He plays a Forest and then pays 3 mana to play a Ramunap Excavator. He then gives the turn to Luke. After untapping and drawing his card, Luke plays a Snow-Covered Island and pays a total of 4 mana to play his commander, Kalamax the Stormsire. He then equips the Lightning Greaves to it, so it gains haste. He moves to his combat phase and declares Kalamax as an attacker at Knots. Knots does not block and takes 4 damage. After that, Luke gives the turn to Knots untaps and draws. He then casts a Fairy Mechanist by tapping the Grand Architect for 2 mana, the Soul Ring for another 2 mana and an island. The cast of Fairy Mechanist triggers Alela and Knots brings a 1/1 fairy token onto the battlefield. The Fairy Mechanist resolves, and on its ETB, Knots looks at the top 3 cards of his library but does not find an artifact. He then moves to the combat phase. He declares Alela as an attacker against Luke. Luke does not block and he takes 3 damage. Knots gains 3 lives. In his second main phase, Knots brings an exotic orchard on the battlefield and then gives the turn to Kai. Kai untaps and in his upkeep, the Sim Brother triggers goes on the stack. Kai reveals an Ungrasped Rampage. Dario again decides to pay 2 lives to deny Kai this card. He then draws and plays a Swamp as his land for the turn. In his first main, he pays 5 mana to play an Underworld Cerberus. Deciding not to attack this turn, he gives the turn to Dario. Dario begins his turn and plays a Forest. He then taps his 2 creatures and exiles 5 cards from his graveyard to cast his commander, Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis. He then follows up by playing a Greater Good for 4 mana, taking 2 lives from the Ancient Tomb. With nothing else to do, he passes to Luke. Luke untaps and draws. He then plays an island and moves to his combat phase. He declares Kalamax as an attacker to Knots and holds priority in order to cast a Blind Blast, which gets copied due to the tapped Kalamax. A +1/+1 counter is placed on Kalamax, and with 1 Blind Blast he targets the Fairy token and with the other the Fairy Mechanist, so Knots is not able to block Kalamax. Due to Blind Blast and the copy, Luke draws 2 cards. Knots, not able to block, takes 5 commander damage from Kalamax. In Luke's second main phase, he pays 2 mana to cast an Arcane Signet. After that, he passes to Knots. Knots starts his 6th turn and again taps his Grand Architect to generate 2 colorless mana, and in addition taps his Soul Ring to play a Chromatic Lantern. Alela triggers and he brings another Fairy token into play. He then taps 4 untapped flying creatures and taps a Plains to pay the cost for a Sephara Sky's Blade. The spell resolves and Knots gives the turn to Kai. In Kai's upkeep, the Sim Brother triggers and he deals an Insult Injury. Dario is not willing to take the total of 6 damage and asks the others on the table to take 1 for the team. But neither Luke nor Knots are willing to pay the life, so Kai puts it into his hand. He then draws and pays 3 mana to play Insult. He follows up by playing a Browbeat. No one is willing to take double the damage because of Insult and he draws 3 cards. After that, he gives the turn to Dario. In Kai's end step, Dario sacrifices Hogaak to his Greater Good and draws 8 cards, discarding 3 after that. Fueled up, he begins his turn. He plays a Soul Ring and after that a Prismatic Vista, which he immediately sacks to find a forest. He then plays a Fiend Artisan. After that, he taps 3 of his creatures and exiles 4 cards to once again cast his commander, Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis. He then gives the turn to Luke. In his end step, Luke plays an Opt. Due to Kalamax, the spell gets copied and Kalamax gets an additional +1/+1 counter. After the 2 Opts resolve, Luke begins his turn. He then immediately moves to his combat phase and declares Kalamax as an attacker at Knots to keep the blood feud alive. After declaring attackers, he holds priority and casts a Channeled Force, discarding 4 cards as additional costs. The spell gets copied, so Luke gets to put a +1/+1 counter on Kalamax and deals 2 times 4 damage to a creature and draws 2 times 4 cards. He targets Knots' Sephara twice and killing it. With all the blockers out of the way, Knots takes 7 damage and is at a total of a threatening 13 commanded damage. In his second main phase, Luke plays a forest and then gives the turn to Knots. Knots untaps and draws, hoping to draw into an answer against Luke's aggressions. He plays a Sunken Hollow and decides to hold all his mana up for a moment in the future. In Knots' end step, Luke plays a Harrow, paying 3 mana and sacrifices an island in order to search for a total of 4 basic lands. Kalamax gets another +1/+1 counter, and after that the turn shifts to Kai. Kai untaps, and in his upkeep he reveals a Sandstone Oracle. No one is willing to take 7 damage, so Kai puts it into his hand. He then draws for the turn. He moves to his combat phase and declares the Underworld Cerberus and the Sin Brother as attackers against Luke. Luke takes the 9 damage. After combat, Kai pays 3 mana for a Toxic Deluge, paying an additional 10 lives. On the stack, Dario sacks his Hogaak to the greater good and draws 8 cards and discarding 3. He then repeats this process with his remaining creatures and draws a total of 11 cards and discarding 9. He then passes priority to Luke. Luke attempts to play a Swan Song, countering the Toxic Deluge. With the copied Swan Song, he again targets the Toxic Deluge. The first Swan Song resolves and counters the Toxic Deluge, generating a bird token for Kai. The second Swan Song fizzles. After the stack is empty, Kai follows up by playing a Viashino Heretic. He then plays a Terramorphic Expanse and sacks it to bring a mountain into play tapped. After that, he passes the turn to Dario. Dario untaps, and in his draw step he decides to dredge 3 cards with life from the loam and puts it into his hand. In his first main phase, he plays a Worm Harvest and generates 4 worm tokens because he has 4 creatures in his graveyard. He then casts his commander Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis, with tapping the 4 worms and exiling 3 cards. He then gives the turn to Luke. In Dario's end step, Luke plays a Natural Connection, which gets copied due to Kalamax. Kalamax gets an additional +1/+1 counter, and Luke searches his library for 2 basic lands. He then begins his turn. In his first main phase, he plays a Mystic Sanctuary. On the ZTB, he searches an instant on top of his library. This instant is Channeled Force. He then pays 3 mana to play a Dryad of the Elysian Grove. He then moves to declare attackers and swings Kalamax at Kai. Kai declares his bird token as a blocker for the 10/10 Kalamax. In response, Luke casts a Chemist's Insight due to its jumpstart ability, discarding a mountain. It gets copied by Kalamax. In response to that, Dario casts a Force of Vigor, exiling a Beast Within and targets the Lightning Greaves. And the Back to Basics from Luke. The Force of Vigor resolves, and before the Chemist's Insight resolves, Dario casts a Deadly Relic, targeting Kalamax. In response to this threat, Luke plays a Whale of Summer. The Whale of Summer resolves, Luke draws a card, and the Deadly Relic from Dario fizzles, having no legal target. The Chemist's Insight and its copy finally resolve too, and Luke draws 4 cards. Damage is dealt and the Swan token dies. Luke passes the turn to Knots. Knots starts his turn by casting an Anointed Procession. On the cast, Alela triggers and he puts a fairy token onto the battlefield. He follows up by playing a Frogify targeting Kalamax. On the cast, Alela triggers again and Knots puts 2 more fairy tokens onto the battlefield. In response, Luke casts a Beast Within that gets copied and he puts a +1/+1 counter on Kalamax. He targets Kalamax with the first spell and with the copy he targets Alela. The Beast Within resolve and Knots gets 2 beast tokens and Luke gets 1. The Frogify has no more target and fizzles. Knots then moves to his combat phase and attacks Luke with the Fairy Mechanist and 2 fairy tokens. Luke takes a total of 7 damage. After that, Knots gives the turn to Kai. Kai untaps and in his upkeep reveals the top card of his library. It is Niheb the Eternal. Dario decides that this creature is too dangerous and takes 5 damage, and Kai puts it into his graveyard. He then draws his card for the turn and plays an Underworld Dreams. In response, Dario sacrifices his Hogaak to Greater Good and draws 8 cards and discarding 3. After that, Kai plays his commander Obosh the Prey Piercer. He then moves to his combat phase. He declares the Underworld Cerberus at Luke and the Synth Brother at Dario. Dario takes 6 damage and Luke takes 12. After that, he gives the turn to Dario. Dario untaps, draws and loses 2 lives because of the Underworld Dreams. He then plays a Lord of Extinction. This elemental is currently a 56/56. He then plays a Forest as his land for the turn. He follows up by playing an Arcane Signet, taking 2 damage from the Ancient Tomb. With nothing else to do, he gives the turn to Luke. Luke untaps, draws and loses 2 lives because of the Underworld Dreams, and then brings a mountain onto the battlefield. He then recasts his commander Kalamax. In response, Kai casts a Pyroblast. The Pyroblast resolves and the Kalamax is countered. Luke follows up by playing a Seedborn Muse. He then plays a Chaos Warp and targets the Underworld Dreams from Kai. The spell resolves and Kai shuffles his enchantment back into his library and reveals the top card, which is a Chaos Warp. Luke then gives his turn to Knutz. Knutz untaps, on which Luke also untaps all his stuff due to the Seedborn Muse. Knutz then draws and recasts his commander Alela. He then casts a Darksteel Mutation targeting Obosh. On the cast, Alela triggers and Knutz creates 2 fairy tokens. The spell resolves. Obosh is now a useless beetle. Knutz then moves to his combat phase. He swings the Fairy Mechanist and 5 fairy tokens at Dario for a total of 19 damage in the air. In response to the declaration of attackers, Dario starts to sack his worm tokens to the Greater Good to search for an answer. He fails to find one, damage is dealt and Dario is eliminated. Knutz then moves to his end step, in which Luke plays an explosion for a total of 14 mana, x equals 10. He targets Knutz's face for the damage and himself for drawing the cards. The spell resolves and Kai starts with his turn. Kai untaps and so does Luke. Kai reveals the top cards of his library. The Chaos Warp goes into his hand because no one is willing to take 3 damage. He then casts the Chaos Warp and targets the Darksteel Mutation. The spell resolves and Knutz shuffles the Darksteel Mutation back into his library. He reveals the top card and brings an Etchings of the Chosen onto the battlefield, naming fairies. Kai then activates the ability of his Viashino Heretic and targets the Arcane Signet of Luke. Luke would take 4 damage if this ability resolves. In response, and trying to save his life, Luke casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response to that, Kai sacrifices his Commander Sphere, drawing a card. After that, the Cyclonic Rift resolves and wipes the board, and Luke takes 2 damage from the Viashino. Kai plays a Cultivator's Caravan and takes 2 life from the Ancient Tomb. He then pays another 2 mana and casts a Terminate, targeting the Seedborn Muse. The spell resolves and Kai moves to his end step. Still in Kai's end step, Luke plays a Crop Rotation, sacrifices a land and searches his library for a Field of the Dead, which he brings into play. On the ETP, the land triggers and he puts a 2/2 zombie token on the battlefield. With his remaining 6 mana, he casts a Blue Sun's Zenith, x equals 3. He shuffles it back into his library and then begins his own turn. First, he plays Teferi's Insight. He then casts a Brainstorm, drawing 6 cards and putting 2 back on top of his library. He then plays a Terramorphic Expanse, which triggers Field of the Dead, and another zombie token enters the battlefield. He sacks his Terramorphic Expanse and puts an island onto the battlefield, which again triggers Field of the Dead. He plays his additional land for the turn, which is a forest and triggers Field of the Dead again. He moves to his combat phase and declares all his creatures as attackers at Knutz for a total of 7 damage. He keeps the priority and casts a Fist of Flame, Having drawn a total of 9 cards this turn, he pumps up one of his creatures and deals 16 damage to Knuts, which takes it. In his second main phase, he plays a Nexus of Fate, getting a second turn. He then begins his second turn, untaps and draws for the turn. Luke plays a Growth Spiral, draws 2 cards and puts a Kessig Wolfron into play, which gets him another zombie token. He then moves to his combat phase. He declares the Dryad for lethal damage at Knuts, and with the Beast token and 4 zombie tokens he swings at Kai. In response to declaring attackers, he activates the Kessig Wolfron with 13 mana and gives the Beast token an additional 11 power. The total of 22 damage are enough to take Kai out as well as Knuts, and so Luke wins the game. So Kalamax is the winner of today's game. We hope you very much enjoyed this video, and please feel free to leave a comment, like and share it, and subscribe to our young channel, helping us further grow. Until next time, and have a good one.